Hello and welcome to Levant TV's Press Review. I'm Kyle Khouairi. I'll have a daily look at UK, Middle East and international newspapers, covering top stories and often looking at them from analytic viewpoints through article excerpts from renowned correspondents. So let's start with today's papers from the UK. The Guardian lead their front page reporting on a coalition of health professionals recommending for female genital mutilation to be treated as child abuse. It also reports on 70 of the world's leading human rights organizations writing to Prime Minister David Cameron saying the government's response to spy leaks is a threat to fundamental rights and freedoms in the UK. And an interview with Turkish President Abdullah Gül saying Syria risks becoming Afghanistan and the Mediterranean. The Telegraph leads its front page with a story on immigrants filling 1 in 5 skilled British jobs. A look at accident and emergency facing shortage of emergency doctors. It also reports on former Justice Secretary Ken Clarke saying the Muslim veil is like wearing a kind of bag and that women should not wear the veil when giving evidence at court. The Times front page also reports on Clarke's comment headlining their story, "Veil is a peculiar costume," says Clarke. Its leading story reports on the head of military saying British troops will be stepping up operations in the world's terrorist heartlands after their withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Independent leads its front page reporting on Keir Starmer calling for public sector workers to face criminal charges if they fail to report suspected child abuse. It also covers Culture Secretary Maria Miller admitting that the Royal Charter on Press Regulations is likely to be redundant because of the refusal of newspapers to sign up to it. Now let's have a look at top stories from the Middle East. An inclusive interview with The Guardian headlined radicalization in Syria poses growing threat to Europe, says Turkish leader. Turkish President Abdullah Gül warned that Syria risks becoming Afghanistan on the shores of the Mediterranean if the international world does not act to stop its civil war. President Gül tells The Guardian that the Syrian nation is dying as an indifferent world looks on, and the territory it occupies risks becoming Afghanistan on the shores of the Mediterranean. The president added radicalization of ordinary people by Islamist jihadist groups was spreading across Syria and posed a growing risk to its neighbors and to countries of Europe. The president states that the response of the international community, including Turkey's American and British allies, to the security, humanitarian and moral challenges posed by the crisis had been very disappointing. President Gül reiterated his view that the UN Security Council's performance was a disgrace. The Turkish president angrily complains about the Western policy on Syria, saying the deaths of more than 100,000 people, mostly civilians, and fighting over the past 32 months could have been avoided. Turkish mediation efforts earlier on in the war were not supported and were even undermined by Western powers. When asked about the risk of war spreading beyond Syria, Mr. Gül says that if Turkey were attacked or Turkish territory was invaded, his government would respond militarily in the strongest way possible. The Turkish president adds there is no question about this. In fact, we have already stated that we have changed the rules of engagements and we have given authority to Turkish armed forces in that respect. I don't see how much worse it can get. It's already very bad. President Gül goes on to say that this is not a bilateral issue between Turkey and Syria. We did not have any conflict with Syria, but when those human rights violations begin to occur and there was massacring of the people of Syria, then it becomes a matter for mankind, for us all, the international community. The Turkish president continues, we are hosting 500,000 Syrians in Turkey, 200,000 of them live in camps and 300,000 in cities through their own means. President Gül claims we have so far spent $2 billion or 1.25 billion British pounds for them. We will continue to do so because this is a humanitarian matter. It's very regrettable seeing the indifference on the part of the international community. Gül says that if the current deterioration in Syria continued unchecked, it would pose an increasingly grave security and counterterrorism challenge for Turkey. If the atmosphere remains as it is, then this can lead to more radicalization and some groups in the civil war becoming more extreme, dividing up, not being under control and spreading across that country. He adds, I don't think anybody would tolerate the presence of something like Afghanistan on the shores of the Mediterranean. For that reason, the international community must have a very solid position with respect to Syria. And when the president was asked whether the US and Britain should be doing more to end the crisis, he replied, "Our expectation was different. We expected more. I think it is very disappointing to see the whole discussion reduced to a discussion solely on chemical weapons." Regarding Geneva II, Gül says it was important that the proposed peace conference was better prepared than its forerunner. He feels last month's London meeting of the Friends of Syria group had been helpful, but he expressed, "Can't hope that the next Geneva meeting would achieve a breakthrough if and when it takes place. The country is destroyed. There really isn't, my opinion, much that can be done now." Former ambassador and permanent observer of the League of Arab States at the United Nations and is chief representative at the United States for more than 10 years, Clovis Maqsood, writes for Al Monitor an article headlined, "Turkey-Iran talks can begin to diffuse Syrian tragedy." Maqsood believes that simultaneously with the civil war in Syria, signals of a possible rapprochement between Turkey and Iran constitutes a new phase that can begin to diffuse and hopefully resolve the ongoing Syrian tragedy. He says that discussions between the two foreign ministers of Turkey and Iran last Friday reflect a serious departure from the polarization, especially on Syria, between these two regional powers. Maqsood states that in the last few weeks, polio has afflicted many Syrian children, while displacements and uprooting of populations from one area to another accelerated the level of suffering, pain, and loss of life. Maqsood sees that his development between Turkey and Iran can hopefully begin to diffuse the potential of sectarian divide in the region and expedite the process of a conflict resolution in Syria. Maqsood quotes Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif saying in Ankara, "We agree to work together against extremism, which is a great threat." During the same press conference, Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu says, "Sitting here together with the Iranian Foreign Minister, you can be sure we will be working together to fight these types of scenarios which aim to see a sectarian conflict." Maqsood also sees that these two important regional powers realize the possible dangers of an unresolved civil war in Syria. This explains why Turkey favors an invitation for Iran to the Geneva II conference. He adds, with both these regional powers joining together in a common approach, this might lead to a convergence that will help remove many of the obstacles bringing about the ending of a tragic civil Syrian war. The writer continues saying that the Arab League meeting at the level of foreign ministers will take place, will make sure that both the Syrian government and the opposition decide to participate in Geneva II and enable the UN Special Envoy. Okay. Does it have a sting, or are you gonna? Oh, okay. The writer continues saying that the Arab League meeting at the level of foreign ministers will make sure that both the Syrian government and the opposition decide to participate in Geneva II and enable the UN Special Envoy Lakhdar Ibrahimi to bring about a reconciliation that has long eluded the Syrian people and the international community. Maqsood goes on to say, "Perhaps I can be accused of wishful thinking, yet it's hoped that with the two global powers and the two regional powers together with the Arab League, we can bring about a long-awaited end to the cycle of violence." To conclude, Maqsood says while the meeting of two foreign ministers and their declarations contribute to easing tensions, it remains up to the will of the Syrian regime and the opposition to make sure that Geneva II becomes a success and that the Arabs as well as the world community expect and hope for. Finally, Maqsood adds today the Arab League must firmly get out of being the prisoner of indecision and resume its nationalist role and responsibility to help bring about a successful end of the unfortunate civil war in a founding member of the Arab League, namely Syria. This is the League's national and political responsibility, but also its moral duty. Writing for Al-Hayat, Hussam Itani claims in an article headlined, "With Ibrahimi's superficial pragmatism," that Ibrahimi's efforts in Iraq in the middle of the last decade and in Afghanistan did not shift away from this approach, and the results in Iraq and Lebanon are there for all to see. Itani claims that the Arab UN envoy Lakhdar Ibrahimi provokes recurring anger among the sides involved of the civil war in Syria. Aitani says the media outlets keep attributing to the man conflicting statements that require clarifications from him and his aides. At times he criticizes Bashar al-Assad and his apparatuses, violence to the point where it is said that Brahimi is a persona non grata in Damascus. But Aitani adds that the next day, Brahimi provokes the wrath of the Syrian opposition, which believes that he has become the spokesman of the regime and is promoting al-Assad's stay in his post for an unlimited period of time. The writer points out that the 1 year and a few months period spent by Brahimi in his position after his predecessor Kofi Annan stepped down was a living example of the diplomatic school to which the former Algerian foreign minister belongs. The writer adds that accusing Brahimi of being biased in favor of this and that side practically disregards the cultural and professional backgrounds from which he comes. Aitani goes on to say that one should go back to Brahimi's experience in conflict resolution diplomacy. Despite the long list of conflicts he was dispatched to seek solutions for, one can say he adopted a single approach in dealing with all of them. Aitani adds his approach relies on a middle ground solution among the various components that lean in most cases on their sectarian and tribal identity, in a way reflecting the balance of powers at the moment of the agreement under an international and regional sponsorship that proceeds without any guarantees. Aitani refers to the 1981 Taif Accord and what Brahimi accomplished in Lebanon through his work in the context of the Arab Committee. At the time, the accord reflected the solid Syrian-Muslim alliance in the face of this dismantlement of the Christian camp that was abandoned by the West, thus implicitly transferring the largest part of the Christian president of the Republic's prerogatives to the cabinet and the Muslim Sunni prime minister. Aitani also reminds us of Brahimi's efforts in Iraq in the middle of the last decade in the light of the attempts to draw up a new constitution, and in Afghanistan that did not shift away from his approach. And the results in Iraq and Lebanon are there for all to see. The writer indicates that the Arab UN envoy is neither seeking new agreements nor trying to change the representation map of the social forces or endorse their sensitivities, interests, and aspirations. His experience reveals he wants to secure a settlement that would end up the bloodshed and destruction during the current stage, without any concern for the foundations on which this settlement is based. Hence, he claims the resumption of his conflicts as it is happening in Lebanon and Iraq, for example, is outside his scope of work, which is limited to the current moment. Aitani adds this would explain the challenging of his announced positions based on the changes affecting the balances of power politically and on the field, inside and outside of Syria. Aitani sees the finding of a formula for the sustainment of the regime is not due to Brahimi's bias in favor of al-Assad as claimed by the opposition spokespersons, just like his harsh criticisms towards the rule in Damascus during the previous changes. He explains that the envoy merely conveyed the transformations he detected in the past weeks along the course of events in light of the opposition's inability to achieve any strategic, military or political progress and its loss in the mazes of conflicts and contradicting loyalties at the time when the regime's image witnessed great improvement after it surrendered its chemical weapons and in light of the international community's willingness to seal a deal with it. And to conclude, Aitani says, yes, this vision does not feature any position in support of the Syrians' right to choose a different regime that is more evolved on the representational and democratic levels than al-Assad's. However, Aitani adds it definitely reflects a pragmatic understanding, a rather simple and superficial perception of pragmatism, wishing to secure a quick end to the fighting at whichever cost, even if through a truce agreement, paving the way for future calamities. As Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi stands on trial alongside 14 other senior figures from the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's take a look at what papers are saying. The Independent's Robert Fisk analyzes Morsi's trial, saying, as Mohamed Morsi goes to trial, General Sisi should remember Egypt is a dangerous place to rule. Fisk writes of the changes Morsi is facing, which includes crimes and deliberate and premeditated murder. and the use of violence, thuggery, coercion, possession of firearms, ammunition, and unlawfully arresting, detaining, and torturing peaceful demonstrators. He says, being an Egyptian leader, however, and if we get to see the man today, Mr. Morsi will surely say he still is the president of Egypt, is a rather dodgy profession. Fisk compares the situation to King Farouk and Mohammed Naguib. He adds that we do not, of course, know the future fate of the man who chucked Mr. Morsi out of power, the beloved and sublime General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who has yet to tell us whether he will stand for the Egyptian presidency. Watch out is all I can say to him. Fisk adds that this weekend, Bassem Youssef, brain surgeon and political humorist par excellence amid Egypt's tawdry television shows, also got his comeuppance, referring to the cancellation of the satirist show. In regards to the involvement of the Egyptian police, Fisk writes, the police, far from feeling any remorse about the August killings, are meanwhile having a field day exercising the post-14 August state of emergency, the very law which the 2011 revolutionary demonstrators insisted should be cancelled. Talking of the protests, Fisk concludes that Mr. Morsi's supporters are, however, promising more demonstrations on the streets of Cairo and other cities today. And the lads in blue in Egypt, most of them wear rather dingy black uniforms, will be praying that the protesters do not disrupt Mr. Morsi's trial if the police can find out where it's being held, that is. People Daily Zihab Abdelhadi asks, what's behind Kerry's Egypt visit one day before Morsi's trial, as the US Secretary of State John Kerry made a brief tour to Egypt on Sunday. He writes, given its sensitive timing, the trip prompted Egyptian politicians and experts to speculate over the real reasons behind the visit. He adds that although Kerry's schedule did not include any meetings with Muslim Brotherhood representatives, some experts here see that the timing of his visit was significant and had something to do with the trial of Morsi. He quotes Ahmed Abdul Khair, a former assistant foreign minister, saying Kerry came for finding an exit for Morsi, and his group adding that Abdul Khair did not rule out the possibility that Morsi's trial might carry a lot of secrets that would have negative effect on the image of Washington should they be made public. He also quotes Huda Raghib, a professor of political science at the American University in Cairo, who speculates that Washington has softened its stance towards Egypt, given that Kerry did not meet any Brotherhood leaders, adding that they are just looking for ways to restore normal ties with Egypt again and are looking for a legal solution for this. He continues to write that Raghib noted whether the US aid to Egypt resumed or not ties with the United States would not come back to its golden days, as Egypt would be keen to build balanced relations with all countries in the world and would not accept any interference in its internal affairs. Daily News Egypt's Nirvana Mahmoud takes a look at the cancellation of political satirist Bassem Youssef's show being cancelled. Asks, will political satire survive in Egypt as Morsi goes on trial? Nirvana asks, what has changed? Has public really changed its mind and turned against the popular satirist? Why has the network washed its hands of its own program? The true answers to these questions are linked to two more questions. Do Egyptians really believe that uprising on 30 June was a revolution? And how do they perceive the trial of events that have started in January 2011 and continue to unfold in the present? Nirvana answers this saying, ironically, the ousting of ex-President Mohammed Morsi pushed aside the religious criticism. Many Islamists did not like the episode, not because of its sexual hints and mockery, but mainly because, in their opinion, Youssef was holding back and refrained from criticizing al-Sisi directly, as he used to do with Morsi. Nirvana takes a look at General Sisi, saying his rising popularity is now the core political issue behind this current dispute. Nirvana says his popularity may be baffling to many in the West. However, he has clearly managed to win the hearts and minds of many Egyptians, not just by his soft-appearing words, but also because he has displayed what the people perceive as good leadership skills, the very skills Morsi lacked. Should this popularity shield al-Sisi from criticism? Nirvana adds that those who shudder from labeling 30 June as a coup should be the first to embrace Bassem Youssef and understand that his satire is in no way undermining Egypt or General Sisi. In fact, it is the opposite. It is a testimony that Egypt is heading in the right direction. Nirvana answers her initial question of will political satire survive in Egypt and says, I do not know if political satire will survive in Egypt or not. I hope it will. Some have blamed Youssef for rushing his return, suggesting that his timing was bad and that he should have waited a bit longer. I think they are very wrong. They are wrong. Youssef's return is a tough test of our desire for democracy. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. Starting with the international New York Times, which leads their front page with the headline, "No scrap too small for an avid NSA." And going to the Times of India's main story, which reports on the Maharashtra state witnessing more women being arrested in criminal cases from 2010 to 2012 than any other Indian state. And to UAE's Gulf News, leading headlines says Egypt's Morsi goes on trial. And the Iran Daily leads their front page with leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali al-Khomeini, saying nobody is allowed to undermine Iran's nuclear negotiating team. And finally, China's Global Times leads its front page with Chinese leader Xi Jinping promising deep reforms to ensure China avoids middle income trap. Hope that was informative enough on today's top stories. I'll leave you now. See you tomorrow with another press review.